There is a moment that nobody warns you about. Not in the books, not in the conversations you have with the people closest to you, not in any of the quiet advice that gets passed down through families about how to survive hard times. Nobody warns you about the specific moment when you are lying in a hospital bed, your body failing in ways the doctors are still trying to name, and the person sitting beside you, holding your hand, adjusting your pillow, telling the nurses how much he loves you, is the same person who put you there. That moment exists in a category of human experience that most of us will never touch. And the woman at the center of this story touched it and did not break. She did not collapse. She did not scream or run or dissolve into the kind of grief that most of us would have considered entirely justified. She reached for a folder she had already packed. Because Margaret Calloway had seen this coming. And she had been ready for it longer than her husband ever imagined. Her name, for the purposes of this story, and to protect the privacy of the people still living on the edges of it, was Margaret Calloway. She was 49 years old when she was admitted to a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, on a Monday evening in March of 2010, presenting with symptoms so unusual, so layered, and so difficult to categorize that the attending physician would later say she was one of the most puzzling cases he had encountered in over 2 decades of internal medicine. She was pale. She was dehydrated to a degree that required immediate intervention. Her heart rate was elevated in a way that did not match any of the standard explanations. And she was calm. Remarkably, almost unnervingly calm. Her closest friend, who drove her to the hospital that evening, would later say that what frightened her most was not the illness. It was the look on Margaret's face. The look of a woman who had already made peace with what was happening, not because she had given up, but because she had already decided what she was going to do about it. Her husband, Richard Calloway, arrived at the hospital 2 hours and 17 minutes after she was admitted. He had been in a client meeting, he said. He had come as fast as he could. He sat beside her bed. He held her hand. He spoke to the nurses with the particular combination of charm and authority that people who are very good at performing concern tend to use in rooms like that. And Margaret watched him. The way she had been watching him for months. Quietly. Without flinching. With the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they are afraid of losing, but that Margaret had turned, over the preceding 14 months, into something else entirely. Into evidence. Into documentation. Into a folder that was sitting in a bag on the floor of her hospital room, waiting for the right person to arrive and ask the right questions. That folder would eventually help convict Richard Calloway of crimes that stretched back further than anyone in that hospital room knew. It would reopen a case that had been closed for 7 years. It would give a name to something that had been called an accident. And it would prove, in the most definitive way the law allows, that the man holding Margaret's hand in that hospital room had been planning her death for years. Stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you is one of the most extraordinary stories of betrayal, survival, and calculated endurance you will ever hear. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly why Margaret Calloway did not run. Why she waited. Why she built what she built, in silence, for 14 months, inside a marriage that was designed to end with her burial. This story is not about a woman who was saved by luck. It is about a woman who refused to be a victim while she was still standing. And the way she did that, the patience, the precision, the sheer refusal to be underestimated, is something that will stay with you long after this video is over. To understand what happened to Margaret Calloway, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the marriage, though we will get there. You have to go back to the beginning of who she was before any of this happened. Before Richard. Before the hospital. Before the folder. Because the woman who sat in that hospital bed and handed a detective 47 pages of organized, annotated, cross-referenced documentation did not become that woman overnight. She had been building toward that kind of clarity her entire life. Margaret Ann Pruitt was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 daughters in a household that was modest in its finances and enormous in its expectations. Her father worked 31 years on a factory floor and never once called in sick. Her mother taught 3rd grade and graded papers at the kitchen table every night after dinner. What they gave their daughters was not money. What they gave them was the understanding that the world does not organize itself on your behalf. That if you want something done correctly, you sit down, you figure out how to do it, and then you do it, carefully, without complaint, until it is finished. Margaret took that lesson and applied it to everything. She was the kind of student who color-coded her notes not because a teacher told her to, but because she discovered early that her brain held information better when it was organized visually. She was the kind of friend who remembered not just your birthday but the small details you mentioned once and never thought about again, the name of the doctor you were nervous about seeing, the job interview you were scared of, the conversation with your mother that hadn't gone well. She absorbed information the way some people absorb sunlight. Naturally, continuously, without effort. And she had, from the time she was a teenager, a particular ability that would prove to be the most important quality she possessed when things got dark. She could look at a set of numbers and feel, before she could fully articulate why, when something was wrong. Not just incorrect. Wrong. The specific wrongness of something that has been arranged to look right. She graduated from Ohio State University in 1989 with a degree in accounting. Not because it was her passion, she was the first to tell you that, but because she was practical enough to know that precision, in the hands of someone with her gifts, was worth something in the world. She spent 6 years at a regional firm in Columbus, moving steadily upward. She was not loud about her accomplishments. She was not the kind of person who needed to be recognized in meetings. She was the person her supervisors called when something needed to be done correctly the first time. When a discrepancy appeared in an account that nobody could trace, she was the one they gave it to. And she always found it. Always. Because she understood that numbers, unlike people, cannot lie. They can be arranged deceptively. They can be hidden inside other numbers. They can be made to appear as something they are not. But somewhere, in the system, the truth is always there. You just have to be patient enough, and precise enough, to find it. In the spring of 1995, at a dinner party in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, Margaret Pruitt met Richard Allen Calloway. He was 32 years old. He had a broad smile and an easy manner and the particular kind of confidence that fills a room without announcing itself. He was in pharmaceutical sales. He was charming. He was from South Carolina originally, Charleston, from a family that, he explained with a self-deprecating laugh, had more history than money, more tradition than sense. He made Margaret laugh 3 times in the first 20 minutes of conversation. He remembered the name of her firm when she mentioned it and asked a specific question about regional accounting that demonstrated he had actually been listening. Her best friend, Carol Bennett, who was also at that dinner, would say years later that she had watched Margaret make a decision that evening. Not a romantic decision. A considered one. Like she had run a quiet calculation and arrived at a conclusion that felt, to her particular kind of mind, like the right answer. They dated for 18 months. They were married in October of 1996, in a modest ceremony in Columbus with 50 guests. Margaret wore her grandmother's pearls. Richard's best man was a college friend named Gary who gave a toast that made everyone laugh. Carol caught the bouquet. It was, by every account of everyone who was present, a genuinely happy evening. And the years that followed, the early years, were, by most measures, good. Richard's career expanded. He was genuinely talented at sales, which requires a specific kind of intelligence that is easy to underestimate, the ability to read people, to locate what they need before they name it, to make the process of being sold something feel like the other person's idea. Margaret built her own independent consulting practice, taking on clients who needed the kind of meticulous financial oversight that she could provide better than most. They bought a house in Westerville, north of Columbus. In 1998, their son Daniel was born. In 2001, their daughter Claire. From the outside, from the perspective of everyone in their neighborhood, their social circle, their extended families, the Calloways were a picture of the American life going more or less the way it was supposed to. But Margaret, with her accountant's mind and her lifelong instinct for wrongness, had already begun to notice things. Small things. The kind of things that a less observant person, or a person who wanted less urgently to believe that everything was fine, would have dismissed without a second thought. A withdrawal from their joint account that she couldn't match to any expense she was aware of. An explanation from Richard that came a half-second too quickly, as though it had been prepared in advance of the question. A name that appeared once on a phone statement and then disappeared, never mentioned again. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask. Not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she understood, with the same instinct that had always guided her through the labyrinth of other people's financial records, that asking the question before you have the evidence only warns the person who has something to hide. She opened a new document on her laptop. She wrote the date. She wrote the withdrawal amount. She wrote, check. And she went on with her day. Richard Calloway had grown up with the particular burden that falls on the only son of a family whose pride is larger than its bank account. The Calloways of Charleston presented well. They had the right address for most of his childhood, the right associations, the kind of last name that opens certain doors in certain rooms. But the money behind the presentation had been thinning for years before Richard was old enough to understand it. His father, a man of considerable charm and modest financial discipline, had made a series of investments over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s that had not produced what he anticipated. The family did not lose everything. But they lost enough, and lost it quietly enough, that the only people who knew were the ones inside the house. Richard grew up understanding two things simultaneously, that appearances were everything, and that appearances cost money, and that the gap between the two was his problem to solve. He carried that weight into adulthood. He measured his life not against what he had built but against what he believed he should have built. And when reality fell short of that image, as it inevitably and repeatedly did, he did not adjust the image. He looked for another way to close the gap. He met Margaret and recognized, with the same instinctive precision he applied to every sales relationship, exactly what she represented. Not just a woman he was attracted to. A woman who was stable. A woman who was good with money in the way that he was not because she earned more, though she was doing well, but because she understood it at a level he never would. She was, to Richard's particular way of seeing the world, the solution to a problem he had been carrying since childhood. The problem of the gap. The gap between what he was and what he needed to appear to be. For a while, perhaps even sincerely, that equation was enough. He did love her, in the way that people love things that solve their problems. He was kind to her in the early years. He was present. He showed up. And Margaret, who had lowered her considerable guard because she was, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, genuinely tired of carrying it, let herself rest inside that. But by 2004, the gap had opened again. Richard's career had plateaued. He was good at his job, but he was not ascending the way he had planned. The house was paid for, the children were in good schools, Margaret's practice was thriving, but none of that quieted the noise in Richard's head that said it wasn't enough. That he wasn't where he was supposed to be. And in 2004, he took out a life insurance policy on his wife. $2 million. With himself listed as the sole beneficiary. Now, and this is important to understand, life insurance policies between married couples are not unusual. They are not, on their own, a crime. Thousands of married people do exactly this every year as a basic financial precaution. But what makes the policy Richard took out significant, what transforms it from a routine financial decision into something prosecutors would later call the first step in a calculated plan, is everything that happened after it was signed. In 2005, he quietly opened a savings account in his name only, at a bank he did not share with Margaret, in a branch 40 minutes from their home. The transfers into this account were small at first. A few $100s here. 1,000 there. The kind of amounts that could be absorbed into the noise of ordinary household spending without triggering questions in even the most careful household accounting. But the transfers were consistent. And over time, they grew. By 2007, he had moved more than $31,000 into that account without Margaret's knowledge. And that was only what investigators would eventually find in that particular account. There were other movements, more complex, more layered, that wouldn't fully surface until a forensic accountant spent 6 months tracing the complete financial history of the Calloway marriage. By 2006, Richard had also begun a relationship that would eventually reframe every financial decision he had made in the preceding 2 years. And in 2007, he began using a secondary work email to research specific topics. The searches, recovered years later by investigators, covered a narrow and specific range of subject matter. The topics were medical. The questions were particular. He was looking for something that would work slowly, that would look like natural illness, and that would not be found unless someone was specifically, deliberately looking for it. He found what he was looking for. And then he paid someone to confirm it. Before we go any deeper into what Richard had been building in the dark, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The woman's name was Denise Crawford. She was 34 years old in 2006, when she and Richard first crossed paths at an industry conference in Atlanta. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, a different company than Richard's, but the same world, the same conference circuit, the same hotel lobbies and name badges and evening cocktail receptions where people who sell things to hospitals meet other people who sell things to hospitals. By most accounts, she was sharp, professionally capable, and ambitious in the particular way of someone who had been told her whole life that she needed to work harder than the people around her to get the same result. She and Richard began corresponding after the Atlanta conference. The correspondence, which investigators would eventually recover in its near entirety, began in a way that was unremarkable: industry gossip, shared contacts, the kind of networking that happens naturally in tight professional circles. But within 6 months, the tone had changed. And within a year, it had become something else entirely. What made the relationship between Richard and Denise significant, what elevated it, in the eyes of prosecutors, from a marital affair into something with criminal dimensions, was not the romantic component. Affairs are not crimes. People have them every day, in every city in this country, and the law does not generally concern itself with them. What concerned prosecutors was the financial component. And specifically, the content of certain emails that Richard and Denise exchanged beginning in late 2008. The emails, which Margaret would eventually print, on a Tuesday night in September of 2009, at her home office desk, with the children asleep and Richard allegedly working late, contained discussions of Margaret that went well beyond the usual territory of marital complaint. They discussed her health. They discussed what would happen to Richard's finances if she were no longer alive. They discussed timelines. In one email, dated November 14, 2008, Richard wrote that he had been looking into options and had spoken with someone who might be able to help. Denise's response to that email was 4 words. Just 4 words. We will get to those 4 words in a moment. But I want you to hold them in mind, because they are the words that, when Margaret read them on that Tuesday night, she stopped breathing for a moment. Then she started printing. Margaret printed 47 pages that night. She organized them into 5 sections, which she labeled in her precise, unornamental handwriting. She placed them in a folder. She placed the folder inside a larger folder. She put that inside a box at the back of her home office closet, behind a stack of client files. And then she did something that, when I first read it in the documentation of this case, took me a moment to absorb. She called her brother Paul, in Cincinnati. Not to tell him what she'd found. She didn't tell him. She just called to hear a familiar voice. She talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. She asked about his kids. She asked about his commute. She said she was fine. She said the children were good. And then she said goodnight and hung up and went to bed. She did not confront Richard that night. She did not go to the police. She did not call a lawyer. She lay down in the bed she shared with the man who, she now knew with complete certainty, was planning to kill her. And she stared at the ceiling. And she thought about what she was going to do. What she decided, and this is the part of this story that I think reveals more about who Margaret Calloway was than anything else, was that she was going to wait. She was going to keep watching. She was going to keep documenting. She was going to build the case that the police and the prosecutors would eventually need in a way that was so complete, so carefully organized, so free from ambiguity, that no lawyer in any courtroom would be able to suggest that it was interpretation or assumption or the motivated reasoning of a frightened woman. She was going to make it undeniable. And she understood, with the clarity that comes from having spent decades finding the discrepancy that doesn't want to be found, that undeniable takes time. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to keep living inside a situation that most people would have fled, because leaving too early, before the evidence is complete, means the person who hurt you gets to tell the story their way. Margaret was not going to let Richard tell this story. She was going to tell it. In a folder. On a tray table. In a hospital room. With a detective sitting across from her who had not yet understood what he had walked into. She opened a note on her phone that night. It was organized like a project plan. The first item read, "Secure all printed copies in location Richard does not access." The second, "Open independent account at institution not connected to any joint account." The third, "Contact Paul, not yet, but soon, he needs to know carefully." The fourth, "Identify attorney through referral only, no local connection." The fifth, "Continue monitoring." She kept adding to that note over the months that followed. It became a living document. A record of everything she observed, everything she confirmed, everything she suspected and then verified. She was meticulous. She was thorough. And she was, throughout all of it, still making dinner. Still helping with homework. Still asking Richard about his day. Still, to every person who looked at the Calloway household from the outside, a wife going about the ordinary business of an ordinary life. Nobody saw what she was building. Not Carol. Not Paul. Not Richard. Not one person in her life saw it, because she had made a decision that the only way to survive this was to let no one see it until it was time. Richard, meanwhile, had made his own decision. And his decision, unlike Margaret's, was not one built on patience. It was built on a growing urgency, a narrowing of his focus, and the specific recklessness that comes when a person who has been planning something for a very long time begins to believe that the plan is airtight. By early 2009, his emails with Denise had become more frequent. The intervals between messages were shortening. The language was becoming more direct. In January of 2009, he transferred an additional $16,000 to the account ending in 7741. In March, he made a trip to Kentucky that he did not mention to Margaret, which lasted 2 days and which he logged in their shared calendar as a client visit, a calendar entry that investigators would later cross-reference with his company's official client visit records and find no match for. In Kentucky, he met with a man named Thomas Garrett. We will come to Thomas Garrett in significant detail later in this story. For now, understand only this: Thomas Garrett was a licensed private investigator. And what Richard paid him for, over a period of 3 years, across multiple meetings, through a shell company incorporated in Delaware that Richard had set up specifically for this purpose, was not conventional private investigation work. What Richard paid Thomas Garrett $130,000 to do was research. Specific research. The kind of research that a pharmaceutical sales professional, with access to medical literature and industry contacts, might have been able to do himself, but chose to route through an intermediary for reasons that became obvious in retrospect. He wanted distance between himself and the questions he was asking. He wanted the answers without the footprints. Garrett, who would eventually cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, described the arrangement in a deposition that runs to 42 pages. He said Richard was methodical. He said Richard asked questions the way someone asks questions when they already know the general direction of the answer and are looking for confirmation of the specific path. He said Richard was interested in substances that produced symptoms consistent with natural illness, that were difficult to detect without targeted testing, that could be administered without the knowledge of the person receiving them, and that, if administered correctly, would produce a death that looked, to a medical examiner conducting a standard autopsy, like the body's natural failure. He said Richard returned to this topic repeatedly across several meetings spanning 2007 to 2009. He said he provided Richard with what he found. He said he told himself it was research. He said he did not ask what it was for. He said, in the deposition, when the prosecutor asked him directly whether he believed Richard intended to use the information, that he paused for a long time before answering. And then he said, "Yes, I believe that. And I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. And I was wrong about that." The substance that Richard settled on, the specific compound that Garrett's research had identified as the most viable option, was thallium. Thallium sulfate. A heavy metal. Odorless. Tasteless. Historically used in rat poison before it was banned in the United States in 1972 for general consumer use, precisely because it is so lethal and so easily concealed. When dissolved in liquid, it is completely undetectable to the person consuming it. The symptoms it produces, hair loss, neurological disruption, gastrointestinal distress, cardiac irregularities, are consistent with a wide range of other conditions, particularly in middle-aged women, making misdiagnosis not just possible but, in the absence of specific targeted testing, essentially guaranteed. A standard autopsy toxicology panel does not include thallium testing. A medical examiner looking at a woman in her late 40s or early 50s who has died of what appears to be cardiac or organ failure has no particular reason to run a heavy metals panel. Unless something has already raised a specific suspicion. Unless someone has already given them a reason to look. Richard had studied this. He had thought about it carefully. He had paid a man $130,000 to confirm his research. And he believed, because he had been careful, because he had routed everything through intermediaries, because he had been methodical in a way he was proud of, that he was not going to get caught. In January of 2010, he drove to a chemical supply company 40 miles from his home. He paid cash. He purchased a compound that, in the amount he purchased, would have been sufficient to cause significant harm if administered in regular, small doses over a period of several weeks. He drove home. He went into the kitchen. He found a container of single-origin coffee beans that Margaret kept separate from the household coffee. She had a particular blend she ordered online, expensive by their standards, which Richard had always gently mocked as her one indulgence. He had mocked it gently and consistently for years. He knew the container. He knew exactly where she kept it. He knew that nobody else in the household touched it. He added a measured quantity of the compound to the beans. He sealed the container. He put it back where it was. And then he went about his day. Margaret noticed the taste was different on the third morning after. She wrote it in her notes app, January 17th, coffee tasted off, bad batch, or something else. Ordered new bag. Richard seemed irritated when I said I was switching. She wrote it down. She filed it. She went on with her day. She did not drink the coffee again. She switched to a new bag she ordered online and picked up at a post office box she had opened 6 months earlier, at a location Richard did not know about, for purposes exactly like this one. She did not tell him she had made the switch. She let him believe she was still drinking from the original container. And she watched his face every morning at the kitchen table for a reaction that would tell her she was right about what she had noticed. She got that reaction on the 4th morning. Just a flicker. The slight recalibration behind the eyes of someone who was expecting a result that was not materializing. She wrote it down. She kept watching. But the damage had already been done. The 3 mornings she had consumed the coffee before she switched, combined with whatever had been accumulating in her system from a longer prior exposure that investigators would later identify, were enough. By late February, she was fatigued in a way that sleep was not fixing. By early March, she was experiencing symptoms she could not attribute to anything ordinary. She made an appointment with her physician, who ran standard blood work and found elevated liver enzymes. She was advised to rest and return in 2 weeks. She returned in 10 days, because the symptoms were worsening. Her physician ordered additional tests. She was managing her own reaction to this with the same controlled precision she applied to everything, noting her symptoms in the phone journal, tracking the timeline, keeping the documentation current, while simultaneously, quietly, completing a task she had put on her project plan 5 months earlier. She contacted an attorney. A referral only, as she had always planned. A man in Cincinnati who had no connection to anyone in her Columbus life. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. She told him she was concerned about her physical safety and that she had documentation she wanted to preserve with a third party in case something happened to her. He received copies of the 47 pages she had printed. He placed them in his firm's secure client files. He told her he was available whenever she needed him. She thanked him and drove home. On March 14, 2010, Margaret Calloway stood up from her home office desk in the afternoon, felt the room tilt in a way she had never experienced, and called Carol Bennett. Not Richard. Carol. She said, "Something's wrong, I don't know what it is, but something's wrong." Carol heard it in her voice, that particular quality that Margaret never had, the quality of being afraid, and she was at the house within 20 minutes. She drove Margaret to Riverside Methodist Hospital. Richard, reached by phone, said he was in a client meeting. He would be there as soon as he could. He arrived 2 hours and 17 minutes later. And while he was on his way, while the admitting team was getting Margaret into a room and running the first round of tests, she was doing one more thing. She was sending a text message to Paul, her brother. The text said, "In hospital, feeling okay, don't worry, but if you don't hear from me in 48 hours, call the attorney whose card I sent you last month, you still have it?" Paul responded immediately. He said he had it. He said he was coming. She told him not to yet. She told him to wait and let things develop. She told him she loved him. She put the phone down. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited for the doctors to do their work. Dr. Raymond Harris had been practicing internal medicine for 23 years when Margaret Calloway arrived in his hospital on the evening of March 14, 2010. He was, by every professional account, a careful and methodical physician with a particular gift for the cases that didn't fit the standard patterns. The cases that required a different kind of attention. He would later say that Margaret's presentation caught his attention on the first evening not because of any single dramatic symptom, but because of the combination. The elevated liver enzymes. The profound electrolyte imbalance. The cardiac irregularities that didn't match her age, her weight, her medical history, or any of the standard risk factors. It was, he said, like looking at a picture where everything was slightly wrong without being obviously wrong. Like something had been arranged to look like one thing while being another. He ordered a full panel. He began the process of systematic elimination that good medicine requires. And on the third day of Margaret's hospitalization, when a specific result came back from the lab that he had not been expecting, he sat down at his desk for a long moment before he picked up the phone. Thallium. In Margaret Calloway's bloodstream. At a concentration consistent with repeated exposure over a period of weeks. Dr. Harris knew enough about thallium, its rarity in clinical settings, its history, its specific profile as a substance that does not arrive in a person's body accidentally, to understand immediately what the result meant. He ordered additional confirmatory testing. He notified his department head. And on March 21, 2010, 7 days after Margaret's admission, he called the Columbus Police Department. The hospital's protocol in cases of suspected deliberate poisoning is clear and specific. They called the police. And the police sent Detective Alan Marsh. Alan Marsh had been with the Columbus Police Department for 19 years. He had spent 11 of those years in homicide before moving to a unit that handled cases that didn't fit the standard categories, cases where something was clearly happening but the legal and investigative shape of it was still unclear. He was patient. He was methodical. He had, over nearly 2 decades, developed the specific kind of investigative instinct that cannot be taught in any training program, the ability to recognize, the moment he walked into a room, whether the person in it was a victim or a witness or something more complicated. He walked into Margaret Calloway's hospital room on the afternoon of March 21, 2010. He introduced himself. He sat down in the chair beside her bed. And he looked at the tray table in front of her. On the tray table was a manila folder. Organized. Labeled. Waiting. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'm here because the hospital has concerns about some of the results from your testing." She said, "I know why you're here." He said, "Do you know what's been making you ill?" She said, "I have a strong suspicion. I've had it for some time." He said, "Can you tell me what that suspicion is?" She looked at the folder on the tray table. Then she looked at him. And she said, "I can do better than that." She pushed the folder toward him. What Detective Marsh found in that folder, over the next 4 hours, as he sat in a conference room adjacent to Margaret's ward and went through it page by page, was not what he had been expecting when he arrived at the hospital. He had been expecting, in the way of a detective called to a potential poisoning case, to begin the process of building an investigation from the beginning. To identify the potential subjects. To establish motive and opportunity. To start, as investigations start, at zero and work forward. What he found instead was a case that was, by his own later assessment, approximately 60% built. The financial records, annotated in Margaret's handwriting. The traced account. The email correspondence. The timeline, a single page, handwritten, covering 14 months of observations in language so precise and free of ambiguity that it read, he said, like the work of an experienced investigative journalist rather than a woman who had spent those 14 months inside the house with the person she was documenting. And the sealed envelope. Labeled, "Open only if I do not survive this hospitalization." He asked her whether he should open it. She said, "Not yet." She said, "I'm still here." He said, "Yes you are." And he turned back to the folder. He began with the financial records. He had a forensic accountant colleague make contact with Margaret's bank that same afternoon and begin the formal subpoena process for Richard Calloway's account records. He pulled Richard's phone records, a process that required a standard warrant, which was issued within 48 hours of his first visit with Margaret. And what those phone records showed, in the first 48 hours of Margaret's hospitalization, was a pattern that stopped being circumstantial very quickly. In the 48 hours following her admission on March 14, Richard Calloway made 11 phone calls. 7 of them were to a number registered to Denise Crawford. Not to Margaret's siblings. Not to the children's school. Not to any of their mutual friends or family connections. 7 calls to Denise Crawford. The longest of those calls, placed at 11:47 p.m. on the second night of Margaret's hospitalization, while Margaret was in a hospital bed and Richard was at home, lasted 1 hour and 22 minutes. Marsh wrote the duration in his notebook. He drew a box around it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he moved on to the next page. The following morning, Denise Crawford checked into a hotel in Columbus, Ohio. She had driven 3 hours from her home in Cincinnati. She checked in under her own name. During the 4 days she stayed at that hotel, Richard Calloway visited twice. On his second visit, he was carrying a canvas bag, the kind most people use for gym equipment or travel toiletries, which was captured by the hotel's interior security camera. When investigators later obtained a warrant to search the hotel room after Denise checked out, they found nothing in the room itself. But in the laundry alcove on the same floor, in the trash chute accessible from the hallway, they found the bag. Inside the bag were a pair of latex gloves. And traces of a substance that, when submitted to the forensic lab, came back positive for thallium compounds. The same substance in Margaret's blood. The same substance in the coffee container that investigators removed from the Calloway kitchen on March 22, still sealed and labeled, sitting in the cabinet where it had always been. Richard had not checked whether Margaret had switched. He had not noticed the new bag she had been using. He had not realized that the container he had contaminated was no longer in rotation. Because Margaret had not told him. Because Margaret had been watching, and waiting, and not showing her hand. Even then. Even while she was already sick. On March 24, 2010, Detective Marsh and 2 colleagues arrived at Richard Calloway's place of work and requested that he come in for a voluntary interview. Richard's attorney, who he had called on the morning of March 22, 2 days before the formal interview request, which was itself a detail Marsh would note in his report, had advised him to cooperate with the initial request. Richard agreed. He came in. He sat down across from Marsh in an interview room and he was, by every account of everyone present, composed. Prepared. Ready. The kind of ready that only comes from having thought about this conversation in advance. He had an explanation for the account ending in 7741. He had an explanation for the calls to Denise Crawford. He had an explanation for the Kentucky trip that didn't appear in his company's official records. He had, Marsh would later say, an explanation for everything, and each explanation came a half-second too quickly, with a fluency that was almost perfect. Almost. Because the one thing that Richard's preparation had not accounted for was a detective who had been doing this for 19 years and who understood, from 2 decades of sitting across from people in rooms like this one, that the gap between a person telling the truth and a person performing the truth is not located in the content of what they say. It is located in the timing. In the rhythm. In the very slight difference between a person who is remembering and a person who is reciting. Marsh asked him, midway through the interview, "Do you love your wife?" Richard said, "Of course I do, that's why I'm here, I want to help." Marsh said, "Then help me understand why, in the first 48 hours after she was admitted to the hospital, 7 of your 11 phone calls were to Denise Crawford." Richard said, "She's a colleague, a friend, I was upset, I reached out to people I'm close to." Marsh said, "Does your wife know you're close to Denise Crawford?" Richard said, "We don't keep score of each other's friendships." Marsh wrote something in his notebook. He turned a page. He said, "Tell me about the account ending in 7741. Richard said, "I'm not sure I know what account that is off the top of my head." Marsh laid the bank records on the table between them. $31,000. 26 months. Annotated in Margaret's handwriting. Richard looked at the page for a moment. Then he said, "Oh, that's a personal investment account, nothing unusual about it." Marsh said, "Can you tell me what investments?" Richard said, "I'd need to check my records." Marsh said, "Of course." He wrote something else. He turned another page. And a few minutes later, when Richard's attorney stepped in and ended the session, Marsh thanked Richard for his time and told him investigators might have additional questions. Richard nodded. He walked out of the precinct into the afternoon sun. And he drove directly to Denise Crawford's apartment in Cincinnati, where a surveillance team that Marsh had dispatched that morning was waiting. The report from that surveillance team arrived on Marsh's desk the following morning. Richard's car, parked outside Denise Crawford's apartment building. Timestamp, 4:17 p.m. Departure time, 9:52 p.m. 5 hours and 35 minutes. Marsh read the report. He set it down. He said, to the investigator who brought it to him, "All right, let's get the warrants moving." And that afternoon, he went back to the hospital. He went back to Margaret's room. He sat down in the chair beside her bed. He told her, without giving her the details, that the investigation was proceeding. She nodded. She said, "Is it enough?" He said, "It's getting there." She said, "Let me know when it's enough." He said he would. He stood to leave. He turned back at the door. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, the envelope, can I ask what's in it?" She said, "A letter to my children, the name of my attorney, and a list, complete, organized, with dates, of everything I found, in case I needed someone else to be able to explain it." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You packed that folder before you came to the hospital." She said, 6 weeks before. He said, "You knew." She said, "I knew something was coming. I didn't know exactly what. But I have spent 30 years finding things that don't want to be found. And everything I was finding was pointing in one direction." He nodded. He left. And he kept pulling the threads she had already identified. The story became public in early April of 2010. A brief item in the Columbus Dispatch, sourced from a routine police blotter update, noted that a Westerville man was being investigated in connection with the suspected poisoning of his wife. 4 sentences. No names. No specifics. Within 2 days, those 4 sentences had been picked up by 3 local television stations. Within a week, by national crime news outlets. Within 2 weeks, by the kind of online communities that organize themselves around cases exactly like this one, places where thousands of people collectively, simultaneously process the details of someone else's worst experience and try to make sense of it. The public reaction was, as public reactions to cases like this always are, immediate, loud, and divided. A majority of people expressed outrage at what Richard was alleged to have done. A smaller but vocal portion directed their skepticism at Margaret. They questioned her credibility. They questioned her documentation. They questioned why she had waited so long. They questioned, with the particular confidence of people who have never been in that position, whether a woman who had been gathering evidence for 14 months was really a victim at all, or whether she was something else. Something calculated. Something suspicious. Those questions deserve a serious answer rather than a dismissal. They emerge from a genuine confusion about human behavior under extreme stress, the confusion of people who imagine they know how a victim should act, and who become suspicious when someone's behavior doesn't match the template they've constructed. We expect victims to be visibly frightened. We expect them to run, or to break down, or to immediately enlist help from every available source. We do not expect them to be organized. We do not expect them to be patient. We do not expect them to stay, and watch, and build a case. And when they do, we reach, uncomfortably, for an explanation that feels more familiar, one in which the composed, prepared person is not a survivor but an architect of what happened. Margaret Calloway anticipated this. She had, in fact, anticipated it years before it happened. In her notes, in one of the later entries from the summer of 2009, she wrote, "The problem with having evidence is that it will look, to people who don't understand why I gathered it, like I had a plan. And having a plan is not what victims are supposed to do. So I need to make sure the evidence is so complete, and so clearly documented from my position as the person being harmed, that the plan is readable for what it actually was." Defense. Not offense. Defense. She understood the optics before the optics existed. And she built her documentation accordingly. On April 17, 2010, 34 days after her admission to Riverside Methodist Hospital, Richard Allen Calloway was arrested. He was charged with attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault causing serious bodily harm, fraud, and conspiracy. He was taken into custody at his place of work, in front of colleagues who had known him for years, in the mid-afternoon, in a way that was quiet and efficient and without drama. Denise Crawford was arrested the same day, at her apartment in Cincinnati. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to attempted murder. She had, by all accounts, not expected the arrest to come when it did. Not because she was unaware of the investigation, she knew it was happening, but because she had maintained, in the private logic she had been applying to her own involvement, a story in which what she had done was qualitatively different from what Richard had done. She had not been in the Calloway kitchen. She had not purchased anything. She had not administered anything. She had listened. She had responded. She had asked, in 4 words, how long it would take. She had stayed. And in the law, that was enough. Bail for Richard was set at $2 million. The same amount as Margaret's life insurance policy. This was not a coincidence. The prosecutor who suggested the bail figure was later asked about it in an interview. She said, "The court sets bail commensurate with flight risk, danger to the community, and the seriousness of the alleged offense." $2 million reflected all 3 of those considerations. She paused. Then she said, "But yes, I was aware of the symmetry." Richard did not make bail. Denise Crawford's bail request was denied. Thomas Garrett, the private investigator in Kentucky, was arrested 8 weeks later, after forensic accountants had completed enough of the financial tracing to establish his involvement with sufficient specificity to support charges. He was charged with conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. His attorney immediately opened cooperation discussions with the prosecution. But here is where the investigation arrived at something that nobody, not Marsh, not the prosecution team, not Margaret, not any of the investigators who had spent weeks building this case, had fully anticipated when they began. Because while Richard was in custody and the financial records were being subpoenaed and the forensic accounting was underway, a discovery emerged that changed the scope of what was being investigated. The forensic accountant assigned to the Calloway case was a woman named Dr. Laura Simmons. She was precise, methodical, and had a particular gift for following the path of money through a complex system of accounts and transfers without losing the thread. She had been given records spanning the entirety of the Calloway marriage, from their joint accounts opened in 1996 through to the current investigation. She had been asked to trace every significant financial movement, to identify every account not jointly held, to flag every transfer that did not correspond to an identified household expense. She had been doing this work for 3 weeks when she found something that stopped her. In the records from the period 2001 to 2003, she found a series of transfers that did not originate from any account in Margaret's name, and that predated the account ending in 7741 by several years. They came from a different bank. A different account. An account that, when she traced it, resolved to a name that was not in the Calloway case file. Sandra Whitfield. The name meant nothing to Dr. Simmons. She flagged it for Detective Marsh. Marsh ran the name through the department's record systems. What he found, in a 37-page file from 2003, was that Sandra Whitfield had been Richard Calloway's girlfriend before he moved to Columbus. That she had died in 2003, in Charleston, South Carolina, at the age of 31. That her death had been attributed to sudden cardiac arrest. That the investigation at the time had been brief, that a standard toxicology screen had been run and had returned no findings of concern, and that the case had been closed with a determination of natural causes within 6 weeks of her death. And that Richard Calloway, listed in her records as her longtime partner and the beneficiary of a life insurance policy she had taken out 2 years before her death, had received a payout of $180,000 following her passing. Marsh sat with this information for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the Charleston County Sheriff's Office. He spoke with the detective who had handled the original Whitfield investigation in 2003. He explained what he was looking at in Columbus. He asked whether, given new information about the potential use of thallium by Richard Calloway, there was any basis for requesting a review of Sandra Whitfield's case. The Charleston detective, a man named Earl Beaumont who had retired by then but agreed to speak informally, said that in 2003, with the information they had, a natural causes determination had been reasonable. He said that a heavy metals panel had not been part of the standard toxicology run at the time. He said that if what Marsh was describing was accurate, then he thought a review was warranted. He said, "Son, if this man did what you're saying he did in Columbus, I don't think Columbus was the first time he tried it." The formal request for case review was submitted. An exhumation order was applied for and granted in June of 2010. Sandra Whitfield's remains were examined at the request of the state of South Carolina, with forensic pathologists coordinating between 2 states. The examination of preserved tissue samples, using testing methods not available in 2003, returned a result that confirmed what Marsh had feared when he first saw her name in the financial records. Thallium. In Sandra Whitfield's tissue. At a concentration consistent with the kind of repeated low-dose exposure that produces, over time, a cardiac event that a medical examiner conducting a standard autopsy in 2003 would have had no particular reason to question. She had been 31 years old. She had a dog named Pepper. She had been looking at graduate school programs. Her mother, June Whitfield, had spent 7 years believing her daughter had died of a heart condition that nobody had seen coming. 7 years of grief shaped around the belief that death had arrived without warning, without reason, without any human hand in it. It took a folder, packed by a woman in a hospital room in Columbus, to give Sandra Whitfield's death its true name. The charges against Richard Calloway were amended. Murder in the first degree was added, in the matter of Sandra Whitfield. The case that had begun as an investigation into the poisoning of a living woman in a Columbus hospital had become a double proceeding, attempted murder in Ohio and murder in South Carolina, tried together where the law permitted, presented to a jury as the evidence of a pattern so deliberate, so premeditated, and so extensively resourced that the word plan did not quite capture the scale of it. The trial began in February of 2011 and lasted 6 weeks. It was prosecuted by prosecutor Catherine Lawson, who had been practicing criminal law for 16 years and who had a reputation, among defense attorneys in the Columbus legal community, for a quality that they found professionally inconvenient and personally unnerving. She did not bluff. She did not overstate. She built cases from the outer edge inward, establishing every fact independently before moving to the center, so that by the time she arrived at the conclusion she was asking the jury to reach, each piece of evidence was already independently standing and the conclusion was not a leap but an arrival. She was, in other words, a prosecutor who worked the way Margaret Calloway worked. Methodically. Precisely. With complete attention to what could be proven and what could be verified and what could not be argued away. Her opening statement is on the public record. The relevant portion reads, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a story about a man who made a mistake. This is not a story about a marriage that went wrong, or a man who acted in a moment of desperation or passion. This is the story of a man who, on at least 2 separate occasions, in at least 2 separate states, deliberately and with full premeditation, administered a lethal compound to a woman he was in a relationship with, for the purpose of collecting money upon her death. He succeeded once. He failed the second time. He failed because his second target was paying closer attention than he knew. He failed because the woman he thought he was going to bury while she was still breathing had been watching him for 14 months and had already built the case that would bring him here. The defense was led by an attorney named Graham Ferris, a skilled litigator who had spent 20 years in criminal defense and who understood exactly what he was working with. He was working with a client who had been composing emails about killing his wife, who had paid a private investigator 6 figures to research the best method, who had purchased the compound, who had administered it, and who had done all of this before, with a different woman, in a different state, for the same reason. He built his defense around the only remaining viable architecture, the argument that the evidence was circumstantial, that the conclusions drawn from it were interpretive rather than definitive, and that the jury was being asked to accept one woman's reading of her marriage as established fact. He challenged the admissibility of the printed emails. He challenged the provenance of the financial records. He challenged, at length, the credibility of Denise Crawford, who had entered a plea agreement and was testifying for the prosecution. And he challenged, most aggressively of all, the figure of Margaret herself. He argued that a woman who had spent 14 months building a case against her husband, who had gathered documents, opened secret accounts, contacted attorneys, and packed a folder in preparation for a hospitalization she was expecting, was not the passive victim the prosecution was presenting. He suggested, as carefully as the law allows, that a woman who was that prepared for what happened might have had some role in making it happen. Margaret took the witness stand on the 8th day of trial. She testified for 4 days. She was, by every account of every person present, reporters, legal observers, members of the public who filled the gallery seats, the most composed witness they had ever seen in a criminal proceeding. She walked the jury through the spreadsheet. She explained, in the clear, specific language of someone who has spent 30 years working with financial documentation, exactly how she had identified the discrepancy in the joint account, how she had traced the transfers, how she had found the account ending in 7741, and what she had found when she traced that account. She described the email discovery. She described reading the emails at her desk on a Tuesday night with the children asleep. She described printing 47 pages. She described putting them in a folder. She described calling her brother not to tell him what she'd found, but just to hear his voice. She described making the project plan on her phone. She described every step of the 14 months that followed, in sequence, with dates and specifics, without a single moment of visible distress and without a single sentence that could be construed as anything other than a precise and accurate account of events she had documented as they occurred. On cross-examination, Ferris came at her from the angle he had prepared. He pointed to the folder. He pointed to the sealed envelope. He said, "You were preparing for your own hospitalization 6 weeks before it happened." She said, "I was preparing for the possibility, yes." He said, "So you were expecting to be harmed?" She said, "I believed it was possible, I prepared accordingly." He said, "And in all the time you believed this was possible, you did not go to the police?" She said, "Not until there was enough to be undeniable." He said, "You made that determination yourself?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You decided, on your own, without legal training, what constituted sufficient evidence?" She said, "I decided what would stand up in a court. I think today's proceedings suggest I was correct." There was a sound in the courtroom gallery. The judge called for order. Ferris moved on. He spent considerable time on the sealed envelope. He suggested that the existence of a letter to her children, prepared in advance, implied that Margaret had known she was going to be hospitalized, not that she feared it, but that she had arranged it. She looked at him. She said, "My children's father was poisoning my coffee." Writing them a letter seemed like the responsible thing to do. The sound in the gallery came again. The judge called for order again. Ferris said, "No further questions." Prosecutor Catherine Lawson's redirect was brief. She asked Margaret one question. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, why didn't you go to the police the night you found those emails?" Margaret said, "Because I had emails." Emails can be explained away. A good attorney can contextualize them as frustration, as dark humor, as the venting of an unhappy husband. I needed more than that. I needed the financial records. I needed the account traces. I needed him to do something that could not be explained away. I needed to wait until the evidence was so complete that no explanation was available. And I was prepared to do that. Even knowing what I knew. Lawson said, "And why were you prepared to do that?" Margaret said, "Because I had spent 30 years finding the numbers behind the numbers. And I was not going to let him bury me before I found all of them." Lawson said, "Thank you, nothing further." She sat down. Margaret stepped down from the witness stand. She returned to her seat in the second row of the gallery. And the trial continued. Denise Crawford testified on the 14th day. She had accepted a plea agreement 3 months before trial, reduced charges, with sentencing recommendations that could result in as little as 4 years, in exchange for full cooperation and truthful testimony. Her attorney had been clear with her, her cooperation was the most valuable thing she had. She took the stand. She testified about the relationship with Richard. About the progression from professional correspondence to something else. About the emails. About the specific conversation, which she dated to a hotel stay in January of 2009, in which Richard had told her that he had found a way to do what he had described in writing. That nobody would be able to trace it. Those were, she testified under oath, his exact words, "Nobody will be able to trace it." She said she had understood what he meant. She said she had not left. She said she had told herself it was talk. She said, on the stand, in a courtroom full of people, that she knew that was not an excuse. Ferris cross-examined her at length. He pointed to the plea deal. He pointed to her prior statements to investigators, which had been less forthcoming. He suggested she was saying what she needed to say to protect herself. She said, "That's partially true. But the things I'm telling you are also true. I was there. I know what he said. The fact that I also benefit from telling the truth doesn't make the truth not the truth." Thomas Garrett testified on the 19th day. He was the witness most of the legal observers expected to be the most damaging for the defense, and he was. He described the arrangement. He described the meetings. He described what Richard had asked for. He described, in specific detail, the parameters Richard had given him for his research, something that produced symptoms consistent with natural illness, something that was difficult to detect without targeted testing, something that could be administered without the knowledge of the person receiving it. He described the substance he had identified and provided information about. He described receiving payment through a Delaware shell company. He described, when asked directly, his belief that Richard intended to use the information. He said, "I knew. I told myself I didn't, but I knew. And I provided the information anyway. And I will spend the rest of my life accounting for that." When Ferris cross-examined him, Garrett did not hedge. He did not walk back. He said, "I'm here because I made a choice and I have to stand behind it. What I can also tell you is that everything I said about Richard Calloway is accurate. I'm not embellishing. I'm not exaggerating. I'm telling you what happened." Dr. Laura Simmons testified on the 23rd day. She presented the complete financial picture of the Calloway marriage, every account, every transfer, every movement of money that had been traced over 6 months of forensic accounting. The total amount moved out of jointly held accounts or assets without Margaret's knowledge, $247,000. The amount to account 7741, $31,000. The amount routed, through a series of intermediate transfers, to an account in Denise Crawford's name, $86,000. The amount paid to Thomas Garrett's Delaware Shell Company over 3 years, $130,000. She presented this in a clear, organized series of charts that reduced a complex financial story to something that was, by the time she was done, impossible to misread. Richard Calloway had spent, over a period of approximately 6 years, $247,000 building and executing a plan to kill his wife. He had invested more money in planning her death than most Americans earn in 5 years. He had done so methodically. He had done so patiently. And he had done it once before, with a woman named Sandra Whitfield, and it had worked. Sandra Michelle Whitfield was born on April 3, 1972, in Charleston, South Carolina, the only child of June and Harold Whitfield. Harold worked as a civil engineer for the city. June taught piano lessons out of the front room of their house on a quiet street in the West Ashley neighborhood, a modest, tree-lined part of Charleston that had the particular quality of American neighborhoods that are not wealthy but are deeply rooted, streets where people know each other's names, where the same families have lived for 2 and 3 generations, where the rhythms of ordinary life are dependable enough to build a childhood around. Sandra grew up in that house. She learned piano from her mother, though she never had the patience for it that June had hoped. She preferred being outside. She preferred hiking, which she had discovered in high school through a school outdoor education program and which had become, by the time she reached her 20s, the thing she organized her free time around. She had a dog, a mixed breed she had adopted from a shelter in 1999 and named Pepper, who went everywhere with her that dogs were allowed. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, a genuinely warm person. Not performatively warm. Not the kind of warm that is really a social strategy. Genuinely, quietly, consistently warm in the way of people who are simply interested in other people and find it easy to show it. She graduated from the College of Charleston in 1994 with a degree in communications. She worked for several years at a regional marketing firm, then transitioned to a position with a nonprofit organization that worked on coastal environmental preservation, a cause she had cared about since childhood, growing up near the water, watching the slow changes that most people who don't live near coastlines don't notice until they are irreversible. She was good at her work. She was liked by her colleagues. She had a group of close friends she had maintained since college, the kind of friendships that survive the relocations and life changes of the 20s and arrive in the 30s still intact and still fundamental. She was, at 31, in the process of researching graduate programs in environmental policy. She had identified 3 schools she was seriously considering. She had requested application materials from 2 of them. She had told her mother, in a phone call that June Whitfield would replay in her memory thousands of times in the years that followed, that she felt like she was finally figuring out the shape of the life she wanted. That she felt, for the first time in a long time, like the future was something she was moving toward rather than something that was just happening to her. She had been with Richard Calloway for 3 years by that point. They had met in 2000, through a mutual friend at a gathering in the downtown Charleston neighborhood where Richard had been living since his return from a brief period in Atlanta. He was charming and socially adept in the way he always was, and he and Sandra became involved quickly. Her friends, the ones who would speak to investigators years later when the case was reopened, described their reactions to Richard in terms that were consistent with each other in ways that are worth paying attention to. They said he was attentive. They said he was good at making Sandra feel special. They said there was something about him that they couldn't quite name at the time, something that felt, in retrospect, like a quality of assessment rather than affection. Like he was always, even in his most apparently spontaneous moments, taking stock of something. But they had not named it then. They had told themselves it was the wariness that comes naturally when a close friend starts a new relationship. They had told themselves they were being protective rather than perceptive. They wished, every one of them, that they had trusted the perception. Richard took out a life insurance policy on Sandra Whitfield in 2001, 1 year into their relationship. The policy was for $180,000. Sandra had agreed to it. Richard had presented it as a practical step, the kind of thing responsible people do when they are in a serious long-term relationship, and Sandra, who was practical and who trusted him, had signed the paperwork without particular concern. She did not know, because there was no reason she would have known, that Richard had already been in contact with Thomas Garrett. That the research had already begun. That the careful, methodical process of identifying the right substance and the right method and the right timing had already been initiated. She was planning her graduate school future. She was hiking on weekends with Pepper. She was calling her mother on Sunday evenings. She was, in every visible dimension of her life, a 31-year-old woman with a great deal of future ahead of her. And Richard Calloway was sitting beside her at dinner and sleeping in her bed and building, in the spaces she couldn't see, a plan that had her death as its conclusion. In the spring of 2003, Sandra began experiencing symptoms she couldn't explain. Fatigue that was out of proportion to her activity level. Nausea that came and went without pattern. Hair loss that her doctor initially attributed to stress. Tingling in her extremities that was troubling enough that she mentioned it to June during one of their Sunday calls, though she downplayed it in the way that adult children downplay physical symptoms when speaking with parents, not wanting to cause worry. June asked her if she had seen a doctor. Sandra said she had an appointment scheduled. June said to call her after. Sandra said she would. She did call after. She said the doctor had ordered some tests and they were waiting on results. She said she felt okay. She said not to worry. June said she always worried. Sandra laughed. That was the last phone call June would have with her daughter in which Sandra sounded like herself. On the morning of June 14, 2003, Richard Calloway called 911 from the apartment he and Sandra shared in Charleston. He reported that his girlfriend had collapsed and was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Sandra Whitfield was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 31 years old. The cause of death was recorded, following an autopsy conducted by the Charleston County Medical Examiner's Office, as sudden cardiac arrest. The toxicology screen run as part of the standard autopsy protocol returned no findings of concern. The investigation was brief and, given the apparent naturalness of the event and the absence of any evidence suggesting otherwise, was closed within 6 weeks. Richard Calloway, as the listed beneficiary of Sandra's life insurance policy, received a payout of $180,000 approximately 4 months after her death. He expressed grief publicly in the way that people are expected to express grief. He attended her memorial service. He spoke to June Whitfield, who was destroyed by her daughter's death in the way that parents are destroyed by the deaths of children, and he said the things that people say in those moments. He was, by all external appearances, a grieving partner. And within 18 months, he had relocated to Columbus, Ohio. And within 6 months of that, he had met Margaret Pruitt at a dinner party in the Short North neighborhood. And within 18 months of that, he had married her. June Whitfield spent the 7 years between Sandra's death in 2003 and the reopening of the case in 2010 doing what bereaved mothers do when their children are taken without warning and without explanation. She grieved. She kept Sandra's room in the house on the West Ashley Street largely as it had been. She kept Pepper, who had been returned to her after Sandra's death, until the dog died of old age in 2009. She kept the Sunday evening phone call slot in her week as a kind of ritual observance, not calling anyone, just keeping the time clear, in the way that grief makes certain people hold space for what is no longer there. She talked about Sandra to anyone who would listen, in the way that parents talk about the children they have lost, keeping the presence of the person alive through the act of speaking their name. She did not, in any of those 7 years, have reason to believe that what had happened to her daughter was anything other than what the medical examiner had said it was. A tragedy. A random, senseless, medically inexplicable tragedy of the kind that happens to people who have done nothing to deserve it and that offers nothing to the people left behind except the naked, unadorned fact of loss. The phone call she received in the spring of 2010 from a representative of the Charleston County Sheriff's Office, informing her that the investigation into Sandra's death was being reopened in connection with an ongoing criminal proceeding in Ohio, was, by her own account in the victim impact statement she submitted to the court, the most disorienting moment of her life. Not because it was bad news. It was, she said, neither good nor bad in the moment she received it. It was incomprehensible. The idea that the 7 years of grief she had been living inside had been built on a false foundation, that the accidental, inexplicable tragedy she had been making peace with, slowly and at enormous cost, had in fact been deliberate, was not something she could absorb in a single phone call. She asked the officer to repeat what he had said. He did. She sat down on the floor of her kitchen because her legs gave out. Not from distress exactly. From the specific vertigo of a reality that has been fundamentally reorganized beneath you without your knowledge or consent. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. Then she called her pastor. Then she called her closest friend. Then she sat with them for the rest of the evening, saying very little, while the reorganization continued. And the next morning, she called the officer back. She said she wanted to know everything. She said she wanted to understand exactly what had happened to her daughter. And she said, in terms that the officer would later recall in testimony, that she intended to be in the courtroom in Columbus when the case was tried. Every single day. She was. She sat 2 rows behind Margaret for 6 weeks. She never spoke to the press during the proceedings. She watched every witness testify. She watched the financial charts presented by Dr. Laura Simmons that showed the money Richard had paid to Thomas Garrett beginning in 2007, 2 years before Sandra died, 4 years before Margaret found the emails. She watched Denise Crawford take the stand and describe Richard's statement that nobody would be able to trace it. She watched Richard sitting at the defense table, day after day, with the contained, performing quality that everyone in the courtroom noticed and that his own attorney could not fully suppress. She was there when the verdict was read. She was there when murder in the first degree, in the matter of Sandra Michelle Whitfield, was spoken aloud in a courtroom with the weight of legal finality behind it. She left the courthouse without speaking. The photograph of her on the courthouse steps that afternoon has been described by every person who has seen it the same way. It is the face of a woman receiving something she needed and that could not return what she had lost. It is the face of the particular grief that belongs to people who have been given truth as a substitute for the person they loved. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Margaret was in the courthouse cafeteria with Carol on the morning the verdict came through, drinking tea she had barely touched and saying very little. Carol would say later that the quality of Margaret's silence during those 3 days was different from any silence she had ever sat with. Not afraid. Not impatient. Just present. The way someone is present when they have done everything they can do and know that what comes next is out of their hands. The call came through at 10:47 in the morning of March 28, 2011. The jury had reached a verdict. They went to the courtroom. They took their seats. The forewoman stood. She was a retired school administrator, 57 years old, from Dublin, Ohio. She had a clear voice and she read each count without hesitation. Attempted murder, first degree, in the matter of Margaret and Calloway, guilty. Aggravated assault, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Murder, first degree, in the matter of Sandra Michelle Whitfield, guilty. Each word in that final count landed in the room with a weight that several courtroom observers would later say they had never experienced in any verdict they had been present for. Not because it was unexpected, but because of what it represented. It represented Sandra Whitfield finally, officially, in the eyes of the law, having her death named correctly. It represented 7 years of her mother sitting with a grief built on a false explanation being replaced by a grief built on the truth. Which is not easier, but which is honest. And in cases like this, honesty is the only form of repair the law can offer. Richard Calloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving that sentence. Denise Crawford received 4 years under her plea agreement and was released after serving 31 months. She has not spoken publicly since her release. Thomas Garrett received 7 years and was released on parole after 4.5 years. His private investigator's license was permanently revoked. The life insurance company that had issued the $2 million policy on Margaret was the subject of a civil action filed by Margaret's attorney, arguing that the policy had been obtained through fraud for criminal purposes. That case settled out of court. The settlement amount is sealed. Sources familiar with the matter have described the outcome as significant. In the months following the verdict, investigators and legal observers who had been close to the Calloway case spent considerable time reflecting on the specific mechanism by which it had been resolved. Not the legal mechanism, that was clear enough. But the human mechanism. The question of what had made this case different from the Sandra Whitfield case. What had produced a different outcome when the person responsible was the same, the method was the same, and the basic architecture of what he was doing was identical. The answer, in every analysis, came back to the same place. It came back to Margaret. To the specific combination of qualities she possessed that had, in this particular set of circumstances, made the difference between a case that closed in 6 weeks with a natural causes determination and a case that went to trial and ended with a life sentence. And when you try to break down exactly what those qualities were, you arrive at something that is both simple and profound. She paid attention. She trusted what she found. She did not allow herself to be talked out of what she knew by the comfort of a simpler explanation. And she was patient enough, and precise enough, and brave enough in the specific demanding way that staying requires, to build something that could not be dismissed. But I want to add something to that analysis, because I think the version of this story that stops at Margaret's personal qualities misses something important. What made Margaret's response possible was not just who she was. It was also what she knew. She was a forensic accountant. She understood financial documentation. She understood how evidence works and what it requires and what a prosecutor needs to take a case to trial and win it. She understood, from 30 years of professional practice, the difference between a suspicion and a provable fact, and she understood what it takes to move from one to the other. She was, in the most practical sense, equipped for what she was facing in a way that most people who find themselves in equivalent situations are not. And that raises a question that I think is worth sitting with honestly. What about the people who don't have that equipment? What about the people who feel, in a relationship, the specific wrongness that Margaret felt, who notice the number that doesn't add up, who sense the gap between what they're being told and what is actually true, but who do not have the professional background, the financial literacy, the organizational systems, or the specific knowledge of how evidence works to build what Margaret built? Those people exist. They are more common than the Margarets. And for those people, the lesson of this story is not simply pay attention and document everything. It is also this: if something feels wrong, you do not have to build the case alone. There are people whose job it is to help you. Lawyers who specialize in domestic situations. Advocates. Investigators. The law has resources that do not require you to be a forensic accountant to access them. Margaret's way was her way, built from her specific gifts and her specific judgment about what the situation required. But her way is not the only way out of a dangerous situation. And I think she would be the first to say so. What she would not say, what she has never said, in any account of this story that exists in the public record, is that what she did was easy. It is not romanticized in her telling. The victim impact statement does not describe those 14 months as a period of empowered, controlled resilience. It describes them as necessary. There is a difference between those two things that matters. She did what was necessary. She did it at a cost she has not fully described publicly, and that I think we should be careful not to minimize by making her story into a narrative of triumph without accounting for the weight of what that triumph required. 14 months of living with the knowledge that the person beside you is planning to end your life. 14 months of making dinner and helping with homework and asking about the day. 14 months of maintaining the surface while building something underneath it that the surface was designed to conceal. That is not a story of someone who was fine. That is a story of someone who was not fine and who did what was necessary anyway. And the distance between those two things is where the real courage of this story lives. Not in the folder, as extraordinary as it was. In the 14 months before the folder was handed across a hospital tray table. In the ordinary days inside an unbearable situation. In the ground she kept under her children's feet while the ground under her own was actively being removed. There is a question that comes up, in the discussions and analyses that have gathered around this case over the years, that I want to address directly because I think it has been handled carelessly in some of the coverage. The question of whether Margaret should have left sooner. Whether the right response to finding those emails was to take the children and leave the marriage immediately and go to the police with what she had and let the legal system work from there. It is a question that sounds reasonable until you understand the mechanics of what she was actually facing. Leaving a marriage in which you have found evidence of this nature, evidence that consists, at the time you find it, primarily of emails and financial records that an experienced defense attorney could characterize as circumstantial, does not automatically produce safety. It does not automatically produce arrest. It does not automatically produce a result in which the person you have identified as a threat is removed from the situation. What it frequently produces, in cases where the evidence is not yet sufficient to support criminal charges, is a person who is now aware that you know what they know, who has been alerted to the fact that their plan has been detected, and who now has an additional motivation to accelerate that plan before you can build a case strong enough to stop them. Margaret understood this. She had thought it through with the same analytical clarity she applied to everything. And she had concluded that leaving, at the point when she found the emails, would not have produced the outcome she needed. It would have warned him. It would have given him time. It would have allowed him to cover the tracks she was still in the process of documenting. And it would, she believed, have put her at greater risk rather than less, because a person whose plan has been disrupted is more unpredictable than a person who believes their plan is proceeding as intended. This is a calculation that is almost impossible to make from the outside, in the comfort of a position where we know how the story ended. From inside the situation, with incomplete information about exactly what Richard intended and when, with two children whose lives would be upended by whatever happened next, with the specific knowledge of how evidence works and what it requires, Margaret made a judgment call. She was right that the evidence at the point of the email discovery was insufficient to support a criminal prosecution. She was right that what she gathered over the subsequent 14 months made the case that sent Richard to prison for life. She was right, in retrospect, about the calculation she made. But right in retrospect is a very specific and limited kind of right. It is the kind of right that depends on the outcome having been the one that actually occurred. And the outcome she built toward was not guaranteed. Every day she stayed was a day in which something could have gone differently. Every morning she made coffee and put the right bag in the machine instead of the contaminated one was a day that required something from her that I am not sure most of us could sustain. I do not think this story should be told as a simple story of a woman who outsmarted her husband. It should be told as the story it actually is. A woman who faced an impossible set of choices, made the best calculation she could with the information she had, paid an enormous personal price for that calculation, and produced an outcome that was, in the end, just. But justice is not restoration. And Margaret's account in her impact statement is not the account of a woman who got everything back. It is the account of a woman who got the truth into the public record. Who got Richard's name on a conviction. Who got Sandra Whitfield's death its correct ruling. And who then turned around and went back to the work of raising her children in whatever was left of the life she had been building before any of this happened. Margaret Calloway did not speak to reporters after the verdict. She did not give interviews in the months that followed. She retained a therapist. She retained a divorce attorney. The legal dissolution of the marriage was, at that point, procedurally straightforward, though nothing about ending a 14-year marriage can be called simple by any measure that matters. She took her children, Daniel, 13, and Claire, 10 at the time of the arrest, and she went about the business of building whatever came next. Daniel, now in his late 20s, gave a single brief interview several years after the trial in which he was asked what he remembered most about that period of his life. He said, "There are things I didn't understand until I was a lot older. Things my mom kept from us while it was happening. She kept things steady. Even when nothing was steady. Even in the middle of all of it, the ground never felt like it was gone under our feet. I think that's what I remember most. That she kept the ground there." Carol Bennett, asked in a 2018 interview how Margaret was doing, said, "She's Margaret. She found out what happened. She figured out what to do about it. She built something from what was left. That's who she always was. The rest of the world just got to see it finally." Claire was 10 years old at the time of her father's arrest. She has not spoken publicly about the case or about her father. The people who know the family have respected that silence. What she has done, by the time she reached her early 20s, is build a life that those same people describe as one her mother would be proud of. That is all that needs to be said about Claire. The rest belongs to her. Richard Calloway filed one appeal in 2013, on procedural grounds related to the admissibility of the email evidence. The appeal was denied. He filed a second appeal in 2016, again on procedural grounds, this time related to the joint prosecution of the Ohio and South Carolina cases. That appeal was also denied. He has not been heard from publicly since. Thomas Garrett, the private investigator whose cooperation had been crucial to the prosecution, served 4.5 years of his 7-year sentence before being released on parole. In a statement he made to a journalist shortly after his release, in what appeared to be a genuine rather than strategic expression of remorse, he said, "I've thought about Sandra Whitfield every day since I understood what happened to her. I knew what Richard wanted the information for. I told myself I didn't. That distinction between what I told myself and what I actually knew is something I have to live with. Her mother deserved better than the 7 years she had between Sandra's death and the truth coming out. That is partly my fault. I can't repair that. I can only say it plainly and carry it." June Whitfield, asked by a journalist whether she had any response to Garrett's statement, said only, "Sandra is still gone. There was nothing else to add to that." I want to spend a moment on something that this case illustrates about the nature of trust. Not romantic trust specifically, though that is obviously central to what happened here. I mean the broader, more fundamental trust that we extend to the people we choose to build our lives around. The trust that says, "I am going to let you close enough that you can hurt me. I am going to allow proximity, and intimacy, and the specific vulnerability that comes from letting someone know the particular shape of your life, your habits, your routines, your preferences, the single origin coffee you keep separate from the household supply." We extend that kind of trust because we have to. Because a life lived without it is a life lived in a permanent defensive crouch that is its own kind of diminishment. And we extend it knowing, at some level, that trust is always a risk. That the person we let close enough to know us is also the person who is close enough to use that knowledge as a weapon. Most people, most of the time, do not have to reckon with the specific version of that risk that Margaret and Sandra encountered. But the cases that are, the cases where trust has been turned into a delivery mechanism for harm, those cases are instructive not because they tell us not to trust. They are instructive because they tell us something about the importance of paying attention. About the value of trusting yourself as much as you trust the people around you. About the necessity of listening to the part of yourself that notices when something is wrong, even when the surface says everything is fine. Margaret Calloway trusted that part of herself. She trusted the instinct that said the number was wrong before she could articulate why. She trusted the feeling that the explanation had come too quickly. She trusted her own perception of the gap between what she was being told and what was actually true. And that trust in herself, in the validity of her own observations, in the legitimacy of what she was noticing, was, in the final accounting, what saved her. Not the folder. The folder was the product of something deeper. The folder was what happened when a woman trusted herself enough to act on what she knew, even when acting on it meant continuing to sit at the kitchen table across from the person who was trying to kill her, and ask him how his day was, while she was building the case that would eventually tell the world what he had done. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not involve visible defiance or public confrontation or the kind of dramatic act that gets remembered and retold because of its immediate impact. It looks, from the outside, like nothing in particular. It looks like a woman going about the ordinary business of her ordinary life. It looks like dinner being made and homework being helped with and questions being asked about the day. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult. Because the courage that looks like nothing is the courage that requires the most sustained, most deliberate, most costly act of will. It requires you to hold the knowledge of what is happening and the appearance of not knowing simultaneously, day after day, for as long as the situation requires. Margaret sustained it for 14 months. And she built something in those 14 months that outlasted the plan that was being built against her. I said earlier in this story that justice is not erasure. I want to return to that now, at the end, because I think it is the most honest thing I can say about what this case produced and what it did not produce. Richard Calloway is in prison. That happened. He is serving a life sentence for the murder of Sandra Whitfield and the attempted murder of Margaret Calloway. The legal machinery worked the way the legal machinery is supposed to work, which is not always guaranteed and which is, when it does happen, worth acknowledging. The evidence was sufficient. The jury was attentive. The prosecution was thorough. The verdict was correct. By the standards of what the justice system is designed to produce, this is a case where it produced what it was designed to produce. And that is not nothing. In a world where that outcome is not guaranteed, where the machinery fails as often as it functions, where the evidence is frequently insufficient and the cases frequently do not go to trial and the verdicts frequently do not reflect the truth of what happened, in that world, a correct verdict matters. It matters to say so clearly. But Sandra Whitfield is still dead. She would have been in her late 40s now. She might have completed the graduate programs she was researching. She might have spent the last 20 years working on coastal environmental preservation, which she cared about enough to make it the center of her professional life. She might have had other dogs, other hikes, other Sunday phone calls with her mother. She might have been, in the years between 2003 and now, exactly the person she was on her way to becoming when Richard Calloway decided that her death was worth $180,000 to him. None of that happened. The verdict did not create any of that. The verdict created accountability, and a record, and a correct answer on a legal document where for 7 years the wrong answer had been written. That is meaningful. It is not sufficient. It is what the law can offer. It is not what Sandra deserved, which was her life. These two things are simultaneously true and need to be held simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other, to understand what this story actually says about justice and what it does not. Margaret understands this. She said it in the impact statement, in the sentence that I keep returning to, that because she was there, because she survived, because the truth came out, Sandra Whitfield's death got its correct name. She described that as not nothing. She described it as possibly the most important thing. She was right to describe it that way. And she was right, in the precision of her phrasing, to call it not nothing rather than everything. Because everything would have been Sandra Whitfield still alive. Not nothing is the truth on a legal document and a man in a prison cell and a mother who finally, after 7 years, knows what happened to her daughter. There is something she said in her victim impact statement, at Richard Calloway's sentencing in June of 2011, that I want to read to you in full, because it is the best summary of this story that exists. She said, "I am not a remarkable person. I am not extraordinary. I am a woman who knew something was wrong, who chose to pay attention, and who refused to stop paying attention even when it would have been easier to look away. The only thing I did that anyone might call extraordinary was refuse to pretend I didn't see what I saw. If there is a lesson in what happened to me, I think it is this: trust what you know. Trust what the numbers tell you. Trust what the silence of the room tells you when someone leaves it. And do not wait for someone else to protect you when you can, carefully and patiently, begin to protect yourself. I protected myself. I am here. And because I am here, the truth about Sandra Whitfield is also here. That is not nothing. In fact, I think it might be the most important thing. I think it might be the most important thing. That is the sentence I keep coming back to. Because she is right. She survived, and because she survived, because she was meticulous enough and patient enough and brave enough in the specific quiet way that is the hardest kind of brave, a woman who had been dead for 7 years finally got a different answer to what had happened to her. Sandra Whitfield could not save herself. She did not know what was coming. She did not have 14 months of warning. She had a boyfriend and a life insurance policy and a future she was planning, and then she had nothing. Margaret had the same kind of future being dismantled beneath her, and she had the knowledge, and she had the patience, and she had 30 years of finding the numbers that did not want to be found. And she turned all of that into something that outlasted Richard's plan. That is not nothing. That is everything. Before we close tonight, I want to ask you something directly. Because this story raises a question that I have been thinking about since I first encountered it, and I do not think there is a clean answer, but I think it is worth sitting with. Margaret Calloway had 14 months of evidence that her husband was planning to kill her. She had the emails. She had the financial records. She had the notes. She had enough, by any reasonable standard, to go to the police before the poisoning happened. She chose not to. She chose to keep building. And the outcome, the conviction, the murder charge for Sandra Whitfield, the complete and undeniable case, vindicates that choice in the most definitive way possible. But the question I cannot stop turning over is this: what if it had gone the other way? What if the 3 mornings she drank the coffee before she switched bags had been enough? What if the damage had been more severe? What if the doctors had been slower, or less thorough, or less inclined to run the test that found the thallium? The folder would still exist. The sealed envelope would still exist. But Margaret might not. And the question of whether her patience was wisdom or something more costly is not one I can answer for her. Only she can answer it. Only she knows, in the private accounting that every survivor eventually conducts, whether the outcome was worth the terms. What I can say is this: she made her choice with full awareness of the risk. She was not naive. She had read those emails. She knew what Richard intended. She packed a folder in case she didn't survive. She wrote a letter to her children. She knew. And she stayed anyway. Because she believed, with the specific, precise belief of someone who has spent a life knowing how evidence works and what it requires and what happens when it is insufficient, that staying and building was the only way to make what she knew into something that could not be ignored or explained away. She was right. She paid a price for being right that I think most of us, watching this from wherever we are, cannot fully imagine. And she built something from what she survived that gave a dead woman's death its true name. I want to ask you one final question before we close. And I want you to think about it seriously, not just as a reaction to this story but as a genuine question about how you move through your own life. Margaret Calloway said, "Trust what you know. Trust what the numbers tell you. Trust what the silence of the room tells you when someone leaves it." We all have moments where we notice something. Where something doesn't add up. Where the explanation comes too quickly or the silence is a fraction too long or the surface of things has that particular quality of being arranged rather than organic. Most of the time, those moments pass. Most of the time, we tell ourselves we are being paranoid or overly analytical. And most of the time, we are probably right to let it go. But sometimes it isn't. And the question I want to leave you with is this: when you have been in the moments where it wasn't, when the thing you noticed turned out to be real, what did you do with what you noticed? Did you trust it? Did you act on it? Or did you let the comfort of a simpler explanation talk you out of what you actually knew? Leave me your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And tell me something else too. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me what city, what state, what country. Tell me what corner of this world you are watching from, because this story came from one specific corner and it has been heard in places Sandra Whitfield and Margaret Calloway have never been and will never go, and I think there is something in that reach that matters. Queen's Tales exists to tell stories like this one. Stories that are not comfortable. Stories that require something from you beyond entertainment. Stories that leave you with a question you haven't finished answering by the time the video ends. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to this channel. Be here when the next one comes. Because the next story we are bringing you is one that has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it, a woman who was told, for 22 years, that a fortune left to her by the person who loved her most had been lost. Who was told this by the people who were supposed to be protecting her interests? Who believed it, because she trusted them, and because the documents they showed her looked right, in the way that things arranged to look right always look right until someone looks at them closely enough. And what she found when she finally did look closely enough, what she had to become, in her 60s, with no legal background and no investigative experience and nothing but time and the stubborn refusal to accept an answer that had always felt wrong, is a story that will make you rethink everything you think you know about what ordinary people are capable of when they are pushed far enough. That story is coming. Be here for it. Until then, stay watching. Stay paying attention. Trust what you know.